Good afternoon, class. Today I will be explaining to you all about painting and finishing aircraft structures, specifically metallic structures. In summary, today we will be reviewing the importance of paint on an aircraft, the removal of said paint in the instances where it gets old or the aircraft owner would like some different paint. Next, we will go over the preparation for the paint job, priming the aircraft metallic structure, and some finishing and techniques as far as that paint goes. So first I wanted to discuss some of the important aspects of using aircraft paint. Back in the day, a well-rounded aircraft mechanic had the ability to paint such structures, but in today's modern age, it's more of a unique facet of specialized aircraft maintenance that is usually done outsourced in a shop. But it's important to have aircraft paint because it makes the surface more aerodynamic, so it usually helps with performance. So the most common way to remove unwanted aircraft paint has always been through the use of chemical stripping. And to do this, the most common way was to use a methylene chloride chemical stripper. But it's very common that this type of paint stripping is bad for the environment and leaves behind a residue which could be very harmful to people and wildlife alike. So there have been a more recent change to using dry stripping, which would be through the use of plastic media blasting, which you can see in this visual aid I incorporated. In this instance, this man is using plastic media blasting to get rid of unwanted paint from an automobile. I just wanted to give the overall idea of how it would be done. This is the equipment and he is used, and this is the type of hose he would use. In the instance, he would use plastic media, and basically what it is it's a very controllable pressure that one could determine, and the machine basically shoots out a bunch of sharp edges of plastic, which basically just take the paint off of the material. So I just thought it was pretty interesting to review that, because it's a type of technique that is being used in the future, and with more research it will be even more efficient. One important aspect too to remember when removing paint is to cover areas of the aircraft which you do not want to remove paint from, or you do not want to damage with other chemicals like the windshields. So you always want to make sure to cover those up with some sort of film. Next, we will go talk about preparation for getting the actual paint job done. It's important to remember that once the paint is stripped off of the aircraft structure, that you do not touch it with your bare hands, because the oils from your skin can leave behind some residue that will not allow the next primer to properly bond with the aircraft structure. And while you're preparing for the paint job, it's also important to investigate for top layers of corrosion, which can be known as filiform corrosion, which can be somewhat damaging to the aircraft structure, but only at a superficial level. So it is quite easy to take off with some type of aluminum brushes or brass brushes. One could easily just take the filiform corrosion off with some acetone. Blisters on the metal could indicate intergranular corrosion, which would warrant further investigation because it could damage even more, less superficially and more internally of the aircraft structure. I wanted to demonstrate here on the, you can see this young lady is using a ultra ultrasonic. This young lady is using some sort of ultrasonic tester to determine the extent of the corrosion, and this would be what we would have to do to determine the corrosion as well in preparation for painting. The next step would be to prime the aircraft structure, and the primary purpose for using aircraft primer would be to provide a good bond between the surface being finished and the material used for the top coats. Now, it was always known that zinc primer was the first and most common used aircraft structure primer for painting, but advances have shown that wash primer is definitely a contender because of how quickly it can be used to cure. But it is overall known in the modern aviation age that epoxy primers are the best ones that are available, and they provide the best corrosion protection of any modern primers. Now, some common materials that would be used to finish the aircraft would be acrylic lacquers, synthetic enamels, and polyurethane. Acrylic lacquers were most commonly used, they were like the first type of paints used, and one could definitely see them throughout the uses of like automobiles back in the day, like the 1950s, 60s cars like Mustangs or whatever you prefer. It just really provides that really glossy look. Synthetic enamels are also being used, and they have also been used to finish automobiles as well. And synthetic enamels would be applied over a zinc chromate primer, and acrylic lacquers would be used over a wash primer or epoxy primer. Now, the best finishing material that is used nowadays is polyurethane, because it's best used for modern metal aircraft because it's chemical and abrasive resistance, and it's high gloss, so it offers the best protection for aircraft structures overall, and it really looks, the most aesthetically pleasing. The best way to use this polyurethane finish would be to first prime the aircraft with a wash prime, and then you would use an epoxy primer as well, and then you would finally put the polyurethane finish over lastly. And that is how the best modern painting and finishing to this day and age would be done. Some important techniques can definitely be used while painting aircraft, and that would be to use your spray gun. That would be to use your air atomized spray gun about 6 to 10 inches away from the structure you are going to spray. And it is important to release the trigger before completing the stroke and not to arc the stroke, just to provide uniform spray, to provide a uniform paint spray across the whole structure. The paint should appear to come on the surface wet but not runny to the point where it sags and bubbles. And one important thing to remember is to paint in sections in which the rows are stacked on top of one another. This is because when you're painting, the center of the gun is going to come on a little bit more dense than the top of the streak is going to be more light. So for that reason, you're going to have to paint in rows in which the rows are stacked about 2 to 3 inches apart from the center. Going in the horizontal fashion would most likely be easiest. So in essence, today we covered the importance of aircraft paint, and how it was used throughout the years. It's important to remember to inspect for corrosion when looking for the removal of paint. It's important to also do all your prep work, and then once you move into priming, there were several types of primers that we can use. However, the most commonly used one nowadays was the epoxy primer, and the epoxy primer is used with the finishing materials of polyurethane, which would be the best finishing material out of the three that we covered. And we went over some simple techniques that one might use while trying to complete this job. It's also important to remember that aircraft painting is sort of like a specialized field where some can see it as like an art at local air shows. So it's just good to know the overall basics of it in the instances where, maybe you want to dive a little bit further into it. That concludes my presentation for today, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.